So in terms of where we see next steps, we're really trying to think about how to put this together, to be thinking about, again, to go back to what I discussed at the beginning, think about parent-child relationships in the context of other factors. And so, for example, in trying to understand what might be some of the mediators between parent-child relationships and social anxiety, I really talked about the middle box here today, that emotion regulation difficulties are one set of kinds of mediators that may be important, but certainly there's others that are important as well. So in terms of what you might think of as more cognitive variables in the top box, you know, other people have talked about control beliefs as an important mediator between parent-child relationships and anxiety, or attention to threat we heard about yesterday as potential mediators between parent-child relationships and anxiety. Also, perceived low self-efficacy. You recall when I was talking about parent-child control and its links to anxiety, I talked about how it might be perceived low self-efficacy. That's what that is develops in the context of a parent who's highly controlling. So there's a whole series of self-concept variables that might also be important mediators. So certainly we need to sort of broaden the perspective here in terms of considering multiple mediators. I've only talked about one of these today. Now the next slide is really busy, so I'm just going to warn you of that. And I know that I'm running out of time here, so I'll just show this to you briefly. Just to sort of, again, the big point, again, don't get too worried about all the little busy arrows here. The big point here is a couple of things. Again, trying to embed the study of parent-child relationships in a broader context. We now need to expand our conceptual lens to consider some of the other things that I was talking about in the analysis of the NICHD data set. For example, that parental anxiety could be important. And it could be important both because it represents the genetic contribution, and there's a social learning component potentially to anxiety transmission, and also that being around a anxious parent may just create a particular kind of emotional climate in the family. I want to highlight toward the end, and I label this social anxiety, but I believe that actually this is actually a slight tweaking of a model that Laura Brumario and I developed for anxiety symptomatology, and I tweaked it slightly for social anxiety by adding in peer relationships, which I think might be particularly important in the case of social anxiety. So, for example, another way you could extend this is to think about peer relationships as risk and protective factors as well. So would friendship be a protective factor for the development of social anxiety? Perhaps victimization is a risk factor. So I'm going to stop there. I do want to acknowledge my students have collaborated in all this work, and Laura Brumario in particular has been really central to it, Ashley Seibert and Shannon Senior also, and funding for the work as well. So thank you.
As a moderator, if I'm understanding it correctly, because you had high BI, it seemed to be differentiating that with effects you didn't expect with low BI. I wonder, going back to some of your earlier regression analyses, when you were predicting social anxiety based on BI and parenting or BI and attachment. A couple things. One is it was sort of surprising there wasn't a main effect for BI. But also, if you're thinking about BI as a moderator, what happens if you put in the interaction term there?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, so yeah, these are all good questions about behavioral inhibition. How should we be thinking about it? Should we be thinking about it as having a main effect, as sort of interacting with other variables, as a potential moderator? And there's been discussion about it in both ways, right? So we've heard about it, even just the last 2 days, we've heard about it talked about in both ways, that behavioral inhibition predicts anxiety, but it turns out that that's more true for some kids than others. And so in our own thinking, we're thinking of it as potentially having both of those. There's probably some main effect component to it, but there is potentially some interesting interactions. When we have looked into that, we have done some actual tests. This is getting to the other part of yours, empirically, what does it look like? When we have tested for interactions with behavioral inhibition, we have not found too many in our own data. We did find in the first study that I told you about, there was an interaction between security and behavioral inhibition, so those kids who are both insecure and high on behavioral inhibition are those even most likely to have social anxiety. You know, secure kids only have social anxiety if they're really high on behavioral inhibition. But looking at general anxiety symptoms in the second study, we did not find those kinds of interactions. So I don't know if that's because it's specific to social anxiety, but so far, I mean, we've only begun to really look at some of those questions about moderation. You know, I'm not being overwhelmed yet with the idea that it's really clear in our data, but we haven't fully explored it either. For example, I was really intrigued by the data that it's really behavioral inhibition in combination with an anxious mother, and we haven't even looked at that, but that would be another potential interesting combination. So I agree we need to be thinking about looking at some of those combinations as well, not just main effects.
In your big model, is that kind of how you're thinking about behavioral inhibition as more of a moderator?
As really, yeah, and I can't get to that easily now. Really as kind of both, I guess. I'm thinking of it both that it might have somewhat of a direct effect, but also integrated in terms of moderating some of these other influences. Yes, yeah, in both ways. Thank you. Do you have a question? Oh, that was your question. He stole your question.
Another question. I have a very general, broad question. In reading this area, I've always had trouble trying to work out what the difference is and what the relationships are between attachment and parenting. I noticed in your model.
Yeah, and I didn't really describe that at all. So how are attachment and parenting related? They are, you know, they are related. And there's quite a bit of evidence that, for example, secure attachment is associated with sensitivity. We see this in our own data that, for example, the kids who are rated more secure and less disorganized have parents who are more positively engaged with them. But there's also, in the literature at large, that's the case. However, those links tend to be kind of modest. You know, we're talking about correlations around 0.3. We're not talking that they're redundant. So, and a CHD study shows the same thing. Sensitivity is related to attachment, but it's very modest. So I think it's important to distinguish between them. They're really not capturing exactly the same thing. Okay, well, so we did finish on time for the discussion. Okay, thank you.